Gospel according to Mark. Now there was a woman who had suffered from a flow of blood for 12 years. After long and painful treatment from various doctors, she had spent all she had without getting any better. In fact, she was getting worse. She had heard about Jesus, and she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. If I can touch even the hem, she had told herself, I will be well again. Immediately, the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Immediately aware that healing power had gone out from him, Jesus turned to the crowd and said, Who touched my clothes? The disciple said, You see how the crowd is pressing you in, and yet you say, Who touched me? But Jesus continued to look around to see who had done it. Then the woman came forward, frightened and trembling, because she knew what had happened to her. And she fell at Jesus' feet, and she told the whole truth. My daughter, Jesus said, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be free of your affliction. The Gospel of Christ. Please be seated. This is not the sermon which I planned to preach this morning. On this International Women's Day, I plan to preach about the unnamed woman, all the unnamed women who walk with Jesus. I was going to riff off that Leviticus reading, which outlines the way in which women have been cast out from the temples of power simply for being women. Shedding blood comes naturally to women. But for millennia, men have feared the life-giving abilities of women so much that they have judged the natural functions of our bodies as unclean. I plan to tell you about my own experiences of being cast out from the Holy of Holies. I was going to use my story as a way of celebrating just how far we have come in my lifetime. I was going to make this a real big celebration of where we are as women. You see, when I was just 17 years old, I was elected to church council in my home parish. I guess I could fog up a mirror, so they put me on church council. Not as the youth representative either, but as a full representative of council. I couldn't vote on money matters, but that was the BC government that wouldn't allow that, not the church. It was the late 1970s, and the liturgical renewal movement was beginning to make its way through to the congregations. And in my home parish, it was decided that council members would function as worship assistants. For the first time, the pastor would have an assistant to help serve communion. For the first time in the life of our church, lay people would serve communion and pronounce the words, the blood of Christ shed for you. I say lay people, but I should really have said lay men. You see, even though I was serving on church council, the pastor told me that the time was not quite right for me to be a worship assistant. Now, at first, I thought it was because I was too young. But then one afternoon, my beloved pastor told me that women were not permitted behind the altar. Now, I'd only been attending church for about 2 years, but I'd never learned about this particular rule. Imagine my surprise when my pastor explained that I couldn't go anywhere near the altar. Not behind that railing. Remember those railings we used to have? I couldn't go behind that railing. Because in the Bible, women were not allowed into the Holy of Holies because of our monthly cycles. I could not be a worship assistant because I could not stand near the altar, near the Holy of Holies. Now, I was going to use that little story to make a point that the church has come a long way. You see, all the while, my pastor was telling me that I couldn't, the church already was. 1976, Pamela McGee became the first Lutheran woman to be ordained in Canada. We're lucky enough to have one of the firsts here. Sonia, what are you like?
Well, I was first woman on National Church Council.
There you go, another first over there. We were already ordaining women, but it hadn't filtered down into the parishes as yet. Today, I plan to preach a sermon in celebration of all the unnamed women whose faith has propelled them to move beyond society's attempts to limit our participation. I plan to celebrate the women who have been ordained in Canada these past 44 years. Daughters of the church whose faith gave us the courage to reach beyond the limits carved out for us by the taboos and the fears which all too often defined us. Daughters who, even though they bleed, they saw Jesus out there and decided to follow. Well, that's what I planned to preach about. And then I began receiving communications from York Region's Public Health Department. And listening to York Region's Medical Officer of Health, I learned a new phrase. You've probably already heard it this week in the media, the phrase social distancing. Have you heard that phrase? Social distancing. Suddenly, I began to have a whole new appreciation of that reading in Leviticus. Social distancing. In the course of this past week, we have all been learning not to touch one another. Indeed, we're not supposed to touch our own faces. You know how hard it is when you wear glasses not to touch your face? It's really hard. And I'm conscious every time I do it, especially when I'm up here. Fear has birthed all sorts of new taboos as we try to navigate our new reality. If only blood were the cause of these taboos. But alas, minuscule droplets have become the basis of so much fear that there isn't a drop of sanitizer to be found in the stores. We're on the dregs of what's left. Right? Social distancing. Ideally, this is what we were advised, keeping between 1 and 2 meters between us. I'm still an old, that's a yard, 2 yards maybe, between us.
Close enough.
Yeah. Washing our hands, my hands are already starting to dry out. Self-isolation. Some of you know that I'm a bit of a germaphobe to begin with. Imagine what goes on in my head, just imagine it. So you'd think that all this talk about public health protocols would strike fear into my heart. And I must confess that from time to time, all the talk of coronavirus plays on my imagination and can make me want to just stay home, where I have more control over who and what I must encounter. When I hear warnings about our seniors being more at risk, and then they define seniors as people over 60, and I realize that they're talking about me, well, it doesn't exactly inspire confidence in me. But there was just something about all the precautions that we are taking that transformed my fear of catching the virus into a fear of being captured by the fear of the virus. So many of our conversations which are going on are all about this new reality. And many of the conversations that I've heard this week, and a lot of talk in the media, has had the effect of striking fear into people that I would never imagine would be afraid. I am no longer afraid of the virus, as I consider the implications of how people are beginning to live their lives. Now that I'm afraid of. I'm beginning to think that social distancing is even more dangerous than COVID-19. The impact of social distancing is being felt in retail stores as our neighbors begin the process of hoarding all the necessary supplies. And for those of us who are wealthy enough to stockpile, one wonders exactly how we will embody compassion when our neighbors run out. Will health department calls to practice social distancing trump, pardon the pun, will those measures trump Christ's call to love our neighbor? Don't get me wrong, part of loving our neighbor does indeed involve doing what we can to mitigate the spread of disease. But as of today, there haven't been any community transmissions of the coronavirus here in York Region. So there's absolutely no need for any of us to be afraid. There is also no need to engage in conversations that feed people's fear. Each of us needs to remember to take a deep breath before we say anything. Repeating rumors is not a compassionate act. Repeating misinformation is not a loving act. Neither is it compassionate to poo-poo someone's fear. We need to listen to what people are saying and respond with compassionate common sense. Common sense does not include burying our heads in the sand. Careful, or perhaps I should say care-filled preparations will go a long way to helping us to respond to the needs of our neighbors with compassion. It is easy to see how our ancestors let their fear of the unknown lead them to create all sorts of taboos, which have damaged an entire gender for thousands of years. Fear and taboos go hand in hand, and there isn't a sanitizer in the world that can wash away fear. Only love can do that. In English, the word taboo is usually defined as a prohibition of something based on a cultural sense that it is excessively repulsive. That's the first definition. If you Google the word taboo, that's the first definition that comes up. Something that is prohibited because our culture has a sense that it is excessively repulsive. But the word taboo did not come into the English language until the 18th century. Captain Cook learned the word from the Maori peoples, tapu. The broader meaning of the word taboo is, get this, sacred, holy, to be revered, to be handled with reverence, great care. Our Jewish ancestors believed that blood contains the power of new life. We are only now beginning to discover that our Jewish foremothers were accustomed to setting themselves apart during their periods. This was a sacred time for women, a time to forego their regular chores, their regular hardships, a time to contemplate the sacredness of life. The word tapu, well, it didn't take long for our ancestors to take something sacred, something to be revered, into a taboo, something to be despised, prohibited. What was once liberating became oppressive. The woman who walked up to Jesus and touched the hem of his garment would have been oppressed by the fear of blood in her culture. She would have been required to stay away, and if she did encounter people, the law required her to shout out a warning: unclean, unclean, unclean. In the desert heat, I expect that the smell alone would have alerted Jesus to the reality that a person had touched him and that that person was a bleeding woman. When the woman fell at Jesus' feet, she was trembling with fear. She told Jesus everything, and Jesus responded not by calling her out as a bleeding woman, but by calling her daughter. As daughter, the woman would have been protected from the fear-filled action of the crowd. After hearing her story, Jesus bid her peace and declared her to be free from her affliction. Now, I like to imagine that the anonymous gospel storytellers told this story in a kind of, excuse me, gentlemen, in a kind of male-muddled sort of way. To hear these gospel storytellers tell it, the woman was healed before she told her story to Jesus. I believe that the woman was made whole after Jesus listened to the woman tell her story. Frightened and trembling, the unnamed woman fell at Jesus' feet and told him the whole truth. Can you imagine what that whole truth must have been? And Jesus responds, "My daughter, my daughter, your faith has made you whole. Go in peace and be free from your affliction." Over the course of the next few weeks, we will need to hone our listening skills. Fearful people will want to tell us their stories. We are called to embody love in the world, and Christ has no body now but yours. Our care-filled responses will be what love looks like in public in these days. The one who we encounter in the body and in the blood, the bread and the wine, is the one who empowers us to be love in the world. May each one of us be freed from our affliction of fear as we go in peace to be love in the world. Amen.